Welcome, everybody. Welcome to episode number 104 of Fraternity Foodie. I am your host, Mike Ayalon, CEO of Greek University. We call these episodes Fraternity Foodie because there is nothing like great food to bring people together. Today, we have with us Margaret L. Freeman, author of the latest book to hit the shelves called Women of Discriminating Taste, White Sororities and the Making of American Ladyhood. Now, Margaret, she researched sorority archives, sorority-related materials and student organizations, as well as Dean of Women's, Student Affairs, and President's Office records collections for historical data that show how white Southerners repeatedly called upon the image of the Southern lady to support Southern racial hierarchies. Her research also demonstrates how this image could be easily exported for similar uses in other areas of the United States that shared white Southerners' concerns over changing social demographics and racial discord. I am fascinated by all of this research, and I know that this particular episode is going to be a very heavily watched episode by all of our listeners, fraternity members, sorority members, campus administrators. So I am just so grateful for the time that we have together today. Welcome to the show, Margaret.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for having me here as a guest on the Fraternity Foodie podcast. I'm really excited to be able to talk a little bit about my research. And I think it's really important, particularly in this time, that we think about the history of these organizations so that the folks all over, including sorority members and fraternity members, can understand what's happened in the past in the organizations and how this, affects current behaviors and perhaps current biases that continue today. So I'm happy to be here.
I totally agree. I think the timing is perfect for this book to come out because I agree. We need to look at this. So let's start with some history here. You chose UNC Chapel Hill for your undergraduate experience, and then later, of course, you earned your PhD in American Studies at William and Mary. I'm curious, why did you choose UNC for your undergraduate studies?
Well, it's sort of simple because I'm from North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up there. I had family who went to UNC Chapel Hill, and it's also really one of the great state universities. And so I'd always really wanted to go, and I was lucky enough to be able to get in. I like North Carolina, Virginia also has a lot of great state universities. So I was able to go to UNC, NC State also for grad school, and William and Mary, and get a really great education and go to public school the whole time. So it's really great.
Those are some fine schools. I definitely get it. So that's wonderful. So what were your initial impressions of Greek life when you arrived at UNC? And then also talk to our audience a little bit about how your experience was as an undergraduate in an NPC sorority.
Sure. I think when I had gotten into UNC, this is, senior year of high school,
Mm-hmm.
I had the idea that Greek life maybe was a larger part of student life on campus than it actually was. I want to say it was somewhere maybe around 25% then. It looks like it's about 20% now. So it was probably somewhere in there.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm, being from an in-state sort of city high school with, upper middle class students who sort of saw that as the next progression that was a natural step in going to college. And so I sort of saw it that way. And I realized that many other women, maybe coming from other high schools in North Carolina or from out of state, maybe wouldn't have had that same sort of impression. I also remember growing up looking at my parents' high school year or in college yearbooks and seeing how this large spread of fraternities and sororities, it made it seem like it was such an important part of the college experience. So I had that all in mind, and people talking about it on the high school campus. And I also just thought it would be a really good way to meet new friends and be social, sort of maybe reinvent yourself when you go off to college. There's a number of people who would go from our high school to Chapel Hill each year. And my closest friends actually went to different colleges, ended up in different sororities. So I wanted to find some other sort of kindred spirits that I had stuff in common with. And I'm not going to lie, I also did not want to be the person sitting at home on Saturday night when everybody's at the parties and meeting the guys and stuff like that. So I saw it really more as this sort of college social space, and didn't really think of it. I think now today, women now look more at the organizations as these sort of professionalization, networking, sort of spaces from the outset. And I really wasn't looking at it as that, or even sort of in the alumni aspect, but more just the sort of, this is something that's a college activity that a lot of people do. And that was sort of what led me to joining a sorority. And I was in one for 4 years on the campus.
Got it. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about your recently released book, Women of Discriminating Taste. In there, you examine the role of historically white sororities in shaping of white womanhood in the 20th century. So I'm wondering, what was your motivation in doing this particular research?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think the thing was because I was in one of these organizations, and you sort of realize, you don't really learn about the history of the organization. I was 18 years old at the time, and we learned these are our families, right? We're supposed to be joining, and when you're a pledge, you're instructed to learn things about the founders, the founding college, things like mottos, flowers, songs, about the badge, and things like that. And you're maybe memorizing all this, but at least in the case of the sorority I joined, this is all happening well over 120 years before I'm joining this group. And I'm sort of like later realized, there was a lot of time that elapsed in there that we didn't really talk about what was going on. And it didn't bother me at the time. But then when I was spending more time in grad school, reading about more concerted study of different eras of 20th century, particularly American history, started to wonder, we learned a lot about different women's groups and how they fit into the history and women's history. And I thought, sororities are really big women's organizations. We're not really talking about that so much or not thinking about it. And I was a part of this. So that made me very interested in learning more about this time that seemed sort of just lost, that I was something that reflected something that I had been a member of. And so, I also wanted to learn specifically about how this worked in the US South, where I'm from, where I went to school, because I had this sort of idea, and I think I was talking to other people who seem to have a similar idea, that at least in the current sort of public mind, people tend to see sororities as sort of really, like sort of an overimportance of Greek life and sorority life on state university campuses, particularly in the South. And it's like, what is this about? So trying to uncover some of that. And I guess when I started my research, I didn't, really know what I was going to find out there. And this has really been a project that came about based on the resources that were available to me and that I, could see. I didn't have like an agenda coming in. I wanted to learn a lot about history of higher education, which has always been very interesting to me. Sort of those institutional histories and student life and student activities, I think, have always been very interesting. So I did a lot of research at university archives at schools in the South, and a lot at the University of Illinois Student Life and Culture Archives, because they have, I would say, anybody that knows about researching these organizations, that they have probably the best like collection in one place. You can get the NPC records, NIC, other individual fraternities and sororities, and some amazingly large personal collections over decades to study.
Wow. Okay. All right. So now it's starting to make sense here. When I look at Greek organizations today, I feel like we have made progress, especially recently. I know obviously there's a big movement going on right now, but you discussed that these groups also have been conservative in nature. They've been inherently discriminatory. They've been selecting new members on the basis of social class, religion, race, perhaps physical attractiveness. And, to me, I understand human nature. I understand that it is human nature to recruit and to be friends with other people of similar social class, religion, or race. So I'm wondering, is this a reflection of who was on college campuses in the early 20th century, or is this something deeper than that?
Well, I think maybe there's two answers here. First, I guess I would always think it's a little problematic to sort of use broad socially constructed categories to just say we're going to, choose this one group over another without really knowing people. And particularly this becomes an issue in, sorority rush, where it becomes very sort of a superficial way of meeting people. So sort of shutting down the possibility for relationships or finding kindred spirits because of differences in race, differences in religion, differences in social class.
Mhm.
But as you're saying, like, I think the history of the discrimination within the sororities as well as the fraternities is a lot about who's on campus at a certain time, and who the white Protestant members of these organizations would see as incompatible with being members of their organizations or families, right? And so we know that the student populations are broadening across the decades of the 20th century. And then sororities and fraternities sort of become these cloistered spaces on campus where members of sort of peer group, members similar backgrounds, white and Protestant, can come together, socialize, heterosocialize, as I call it in my article and in the book, within these sort of protected circles, like you can date people your parents would want you to date kind of thing. But then as other people begin to show up on campus in these broadening populations, whether that's working class whites or non-Protestants or people of different races and ethnicities, the sorority discrimination begins to sort of broaden to sort of exclude people that they think would not be, congenial friendship members. And so that ends up eventually being mostly about being non-white, but it's sort of a progression over time, so like even in the periods where all the students are white and Protestant, there's not always enough memberships to go around. People end up with their feelings hurt. Either there's not enough sororities, or for some reason the sorority decides they don't want to extend a membership to a woman for a certain reason. And I would say it's not like Harry Potter where everyone gets magically sorted into a house and it's perfect and no one questions it and it's great. It's like that's when that sort of discrimination as being selective but also being discriminatory, I think, really gets going. And sororities are about setting members off from other women, elevating themselves, right? And this is particularly in a time where there's sort of a lot of people are moving around the country, more mobile populations. People are trying to show themselves as part of this growing middle to upper class in America. Maybe their families had even moved, immigrated, assimilated to American culture in the 19th century. And so they're still trying to prove themselves as true Americans. And this is a way to do that, right? If you can join this group of true American ladies, you're sort of solidifying your role and your citizenship as Americans, as white Americans, white Protestant for the most part. And so just choosing different ways that people maybe aren't able to participate or don't seem part of the middle class. Would that be like not participate in the growing consumer culture? Say, oh, we're going to look at this possible member who has to make her own clothes. We don't maybe want that, or we don't want a woman whose father is not a member of the professional class. And so there's different ways that they can be selective and discriminate against certain types of women to uphold the certain ideal of the membership that they want, perhaps within the chapter or within the larger national organization. And as this moves on, some of this I would say is, on a campus by campus basis, because again, in certain regions, you may have more Catholic students or more Jewish students. And then there may be something which is maybe only on that certain chapter by chapter basis, where they're saying, well, we need a bylaw or an unwritten rule, which always becomes a bit problematic and can kind of just hang around forever, to say, well, we're not going to take any Catholic women, or we're going to take a very limited amount so that our chapter does not become, sort of quote, overrun with the Catholic element and become seen as a Catholic sorority. So you start having stuff like that. And then I'd say particularly after World War II, and there still certainly is focus on the problems of Jewish students rushing and the Nationals not wanting to allow them to pledge Jewish, fraternities or sororities, fraternities or sororities pledge Jewish members. But after World War II, when there's like this growing national interest in addressing issues of racial discrimination, that's when it really starts to switch more the press and the publicity to the issue of race more, I think, is the main sort of challenge. And in this period, that's when NPC and NIC groups begin to see this sort of the African American as a threat to their, all white membership. And it's not, it's on non-Southern campuses as well as Southern campuses, because, campuses in the non-South may not have barred Black students, but there was always this sort of de facto social segregation that occurred, as in northern cities and northern communities. It just wasn't codified like in the South, where they're having to dismantle this legally to try to desegregate things there. But across the board, you see sorority national advisors and national officers, discouraging or prohibiting chapters everywhere from pledging African American women. And there's a real sort of concerted effort from the 1940s on, through fraternity and sorority alumni networks, to really keep tabs on different campuses. What's going on? What's the cultural climate there? Are people agitating, as they would say, and sort of drumming up this discrimination hysteria, is what they also call it, to try to challenge what they see as their private membership selection, or what they call, certainly by the 1950s, freedom of association in their membership. The idea that we're an organization, we can associate with who we want, and they tie it up a lot in ideas of American democracy and the American way, which plays pretty well, I guess, when there's a lot of fears about communism in the 1950s. See, the fraternities and sororities are more American because we are allowed to associate with who we want in our private organizations. I guess the one thing I would say out of this is that I know that the freedom of association phrasing is still used today in some communication, and knowing the story about where that came from and what it really was sort of talking about, it seems a little disconcerting now.
This is also fascinating to me. See, the organization that I joined was an NIC organization, and in the 30s and 40s, they had certain laws in the bylaws there that basically said predominantly white Protestant members, and then that was removed in the 30s. But the chapters at that particular time, they were making their own decisions in terms of who they wanted in their organization. And so, certainly, even while the bylaw was in place for white Protestant members, they were still allowing Jewish members to join. They were still allowing Black members to join. But the organization that I joined also started in Vincennes, Indiana, and has a very high Northeast concentration. So I'm wondering, and I know your focus is mainly through a Southern lens, but there are also many sororities that were founded at non-Southern schools in places like New York, for example. And so if we take a historically Jewish sorority, for example, that has a high concentration in the Northeast and California, I'm just wondering, do you find any evidence to suggest that this is true of organizations that are predominantly in the Northeast, for example? I mean, is this something across the board, or is this something just really kind of in the Southern schools?
No, it was not just in the Southern schools. I think that's one of the key things here. I was looking at first at sort of the organizations where they started in the South, but it became a national story when I looked at the MPC records and sort of saw the communication that was going on and the information being disseminated, throughout the country to all the different chapters. And, I think we had women in the MPC across the US as well as in Canada. And so I think the thing I'm looking at here is that they're looking at this ideal of ladyhood as, because they're selling this sort of social education as part of why they should be on campus in the first place. It's like, we're here to train these women. This is important. And the deans of women and other administrators see that as a positive thing. And so the idea of the ladyhood that they're selling is really this model that's based, I think, on the ideal of the sort of the mythic ideal of the Southern lady. And she's white, she's hyper feminine, she's pious, she's sort of quietly alluring, meaning she's like sexy, but she's not overly sexual. She's not threatening to male power or superiority. She's not going to come in and take men's jobs. She's happy being a wife and homemaker. And from the late 19th century up to World War II, there is in American popular culture this preoccupation with sort of Southern culture that gets nationally transported really through things like advertising, movies, songs, this sort of birth of heritage tourism when people start automobiling in the 1920s. But all of this is built around this image of the imagined South, sort of the old South, plantation narrative where, that's obscuring all of the horrors and violence of slavery, and imagining that all white Southerners live on these plantations. And so sorority women are really on top of all of this. They are, and this is nationally, they're interested in having different I guess rush parties or teas based on sort of plantation themed skits. They do conferences based on Gone with the Wind, which is a huge sort of cultural touch point in the 1930s, and go on these tours. They also see the Southern members as sort of more charming and beautiful. It's sort of like the epitome of womanhood that they would like, that's the epitome of woman, and that's what we should be as American women. And so even if they aren't saying this in, writing it down, the suggestions they're making seem clear that that is their model for what would be how they want to present themselves. In the South, though, it starts to become more clearly associated, of course, with acts of violence, racial violence, and you see protests because this is becoming more visible on the television in the 50s and 60s. But the sorority members outside the South are, standing with the other sorority sisters in saying, these people are members of our family. We all have to be on board with who we would take in. It's like everybody is supposed to be acceptable to every member of every chapter, which, is kind of a ludicrous thing, because half the time you're maybe not going to agree with everybody in your chapter anyway. But no, you're supposed to be able to walk into any house and it feels like your family, right? And so the saying here would be, you might have women in Massachusetts, women in Pennsylvania who are saying, well, it's not us. We are not racist. We don't have a problem with this. But how would the people in the South, our sisters there, feel? They couldn't come into our house if we had an African-American woman sitting at our dinner table eating with us as a member. And so you get that sort of covering and use of the South as a way to say it's not us, even though the women from Massachusetts and Pennsylvania were clearly involved in organizations behind the scenes who were just as concerned in upholding segregation racially and religiously of the organizations as women in the South. They had a lot of commonality with sort of the Southern segregationists of that time in the mid-century.
This is so interesting. And so, all right, so your research now shows how white Southerners repeatedly called upon this image of the Southern lady that you talk about to support these Southern racial hierarchies. So talk to us about how are there similar uses in other areas of the United States that share these white Southerners' concerns over changing social demographics and racial discord?
Right. So, I mean, that was what I was just sort of talking about a little bit, that the, if you're at a sorority in Pennsylvania and you want to have an African-American woman join, and your advisor is going to come in and say, we're going to not allow you to join or not allow this woman to join, it becomes clearly, you either have to totally disagree, shut down your chapter, give your charter back, or just sort of not say anything and go on. And so it seems like this may have happened in a number of cases where you just don't want to step up and say anything against the national officers. So you in cases where something happened, there was an instance actually in Vermont in the 40s where this was Alpha Zeta Delta, basically prohibited this chapter from allowing one of the African-American women, she was a student from Washington, D.C., to join. And the women in the chapter were so indignant that, they wanted her as their friend and their member. They handed back the chapter's charter to the national organization. So you see this happening, and I think that there are many stories that we don't know about where people eventually just sort of stepped back and said it's not worth, fighting against the nationals, fighting against the advisors. So, I would love to learn more about these other hidden histories, but I think that it is more common than we thought. And it's, again, something that's used in looking at the South as saying we're supporting their interests, whereas that covered for a lot of of chapters, a lot of national organizations who may have had a variety, people may have had a variety of takes on how this went or how this should play out, but that was controlled certainly by certain national leaders at individual sororities and NBC that people didn't seem to step up against to say anything to disagree with.
Mm-hmm. This is really fascinating. It's also interesting to look at it from, what's going on today, because obviously fraternities and sororities are single-sex organizations. There are chapters that would like to, let's say, have both men and women in their organizations. And obviously that's against the bylaws of the organization. So at that point, they're no longer a part of the national organization and they decide to go off and do their own thing. So it is interesting to look at it from your research versus some of the things that are happening today. And you also talk about the history of contemporary sororities and their difficult campus relationships. What did you mean by that? How so?
Yeah, well, I think what I was alluding to in this is sort of like there's always this tension, of having Greek-led organizations on campus because, as I originally thought of them as student activities, they aren't just college organizations. There's so much that goes on beyond the college years and so much control that can happen and people pulling the purse strings from beyond the campus that I learned more about during the research. And you think, okay, well, these organizations sort of fall under student activities. They sort of fall under maybe the Office of Greek Life or something like that on a campus. But in the period that I was looking at that time, it was really the Dean of Women who was sort of having to deal with the regular women students, the unaffiliated, the affiliated, as well as the alumni who might be interacting with the campus as well. So there was sort of a little bit of like who's in charge, who's like meeting out the rules in different places at different times. Because there was the Panhellenic as well, the student group, and maybe some advisors that would come up with rules. But then you could occasionally have some sort of emissary from the national sorority swoop in and want to do something differently. And then there's sort of a little bit of difficulty there between the administrators, the students, and the outside, the people from outside campus who are controlling these organizations. And I mean, I think a lot of the deans of women really saw sororities for many years as very helpful on campus. That social education they're selling seemed useful because maybe they didn't have enough people to really be taking care and watching all of these women on the campus at the time if they didn't have a large staff in the earlier years. And so they would see the sororities as creating this sort of proper behavioral norms for all the women on campus that they believed even the non-sorority women would look up to the sorority women as models of good behavior. But there was always the problem of rush. And that always sort of was like, oh, but rush, because it was something that the Deans of Women's Office had to sort of take care of that too, deal with new sororities that were interested in coming to campus, deal with the hurt feelings of the sorority, the non-sorority women who had gone through rush and did not get a bid or did not get to join the sorority they wanted. So there was a lot of angst and distress that went on each year, and discussions on some campuses like, can we change rush? Can we make it more less stressful, more meaningful? Should we change it to a different time of the school year? So there was a lot of that going on throughout time. And there's still conversations, I'm sure, about this today. And there was also, I would say, this sort of a shift in the relationship between, at least in the sororities, the sort of the national leaders and the deans of women by, say, the 1960s. Because before, they had always, they'd worked very well together. Deans of women often had been sorority women themselves. They would have the NPC meeting and the National Association of Deans of Women would sort of meet at the same time. So they'd have this joint session because they could discuss things that were, important to both of the groups. But then by the 1960s, the deans of women and a lot of the student personnel workers, this may include deans of men as well, were beginning to be seen more as part of the liberal establishment on campus who are having, as part of their jobs, are having to ensure that student activities, organizations on campus are not discriminating in any way based on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So after this time, you start seeing this tension again here that's based more on like, they're going to be challenging our membership against the challenge to the freedom of association. And so you would see the sorority women are talking about that that joint session with much more consternation than they had been before, of like, what are they going to try to make us do now, sort of thing. So that was where I was seeing this sort of change in how these groups got along. And it may have shifted back now with having more student personnel, trained fraternity and sorority alumni working in some of these offices. But then again, that sets that whole office off from the rest of the campus. So I don't know if it is still sort of a separated thing, or if there are tensions today in that same way.
Wow. Okay, so the focus of your research is clearly from sorority archives. So how does your research on historically white sororities compare to historically white fraternities? So in other words, from what you can tell, are there any differences in the fraternity approach during this time?
Well, I mean, I didn't read so much in the fraternity records. I saw some of the interaction with the fraternity alumni and the sorority alumni. What I feel the difference in approach might have been was just the sort of level of control and micromanagement that went on within the sororities. From from the local advisor level, to the regionals, to the nationals, to the MPC, there's so much control of individual chapters. I mean, of course, it might be different based on whether there was actually an advisor in your area or something, but they're always going to send somebody else out to check on you. And I felt like there was a little bit less, focus on programming and booklets and, all these educational aspects that the sororities were getting, or were supposed to be enacting at least, on the fraternity side of things. And, I don't know if it's just something more about the nature of how it was thought of when women in this time went off to college, leaving the safety of the home, being on their own. There's all these, campus parietals, booklets of rules for what women can and can't do on campus. Whereas men, it's like, oh, don't fight, maybe go to church on Sunday. They're sort of seen as adults who can take care of themselves. They don't need this protection and sort of guidance at all times. And that may have been some of the difference, that the women were used to receiving all of these rules all the time, which maybe they would chafe at sometimes. And certainly there were instances in my period of study over and over where there was this sort of generational gap and a lot of anger, and there would be things would come to a head on campus when somebody came to visit and didn't agree with what was going on in the chapter. But I do still think that if you look even at the way Rush is handled as an example in a sorority, this sort of like overwrought, highly choreographed, days of preparation, nights of reading, all of this like paperwork. And then it's just like, hey, come over and have a beer and a hot dog, or something in the fraternity. I feel like if you kind of extrapolate from those two situations, that can also give you a good picture of just sort of the level of the control. But I will say that it seemed like sort of toward the end of my period of study, like the late 70s, when fraternities and sororities are sort of regaining popularity on campus after they had certainly sort of had a low point during the 60s counterculture, when people were not really interested in having the man or the woman tell them what they're doing to do, and or experimenting with sort of less refined dress and manners and things that sororities would have been sort of horrified by. They come back to these organizations a little bit more there, late 70s, early 80s. And it seemed that fraternities at that point maybe had more interest in trying to enact some of these programs to say, okay, we really want to help build character and not be so hands off. I don't know if that continued, but that it looked like they were trying to make a little bit of a different path at that time, when they were sort of trying to rebuild and rebrand.
Very good. All right. So, and the other thing is, you also wrote a chapter in a book called Rethinking Campus Life, New Perspectives on the History of College Students in the United States. And your particular chapter discusses heterosocializing in white college sororities. So I'm wondering, what were your findings in your research there?
Sure. And I talk a little bit about this in the book too. It's just in a slightly, probably different form. But, I look at how these MPC sororities sort of changed in focus from groups that functioned as these more supportive spaces, women's only spaces, particularly in the early years of coeducation on these college campuses that had been primarily male before that. and where they had really very little sort of infrastructure, maybe for women students, maybe no dorms, maybe no deans of women yet. It was just the sort of the insular group of the sorority they founded, or a secret society they founded. But then over time, as we get these larger populations of students coming to campus, and the sort of what college is about sort of shifts from being more focused on education and sort of like life in academe, that these women are coming because it's seen as part of what the middle class, young adult would do, go to college. So we start to see an interest instead of this sort of insular women's group to having what I call the heterosocializing with fraternities. And that really becomes a primary goal of these organizations, because it helps to ensure their popularity on campus. So there's also the change in dating culture, because now, instead of that happening at home, sort of in the protected space of the family home, you're in your family home, the sorority, right, in college. And so you've got rules written down, or policing of behavior by sorority sisters, to make sure that you are presenting yourself as a member or a pledge in a way that they would want, in accord with what they want the chapter to be presented as on campus. So you need, and it's a lot of it then is about this sort of superficial presentation of personality over character, or a physical attractiveness and wearing the right clothes, and being able to attract the top fraternities so that your chapter maintains its popularity on campus, so it ranks on campus. And I think that seeing the sort of shift there, you also talk about the spaces where this takes place. So I look at sort of the private spaces of fraternity houses, or also off-campus sort of socials or formals, where there's probably free-flowing alcohol. There's not necessarily anybody like a house mother, or no one's tips trained hanging out there to take care of this. And so it can put these women in really dangerous situations. And this is not, in a time when sexual assault and rape is not talked about. It's sort of worked into these guidelines, in a very hidden way, that these women are supposed to just understand that they're responsible for maintaining the propriety and behavior of the men who they're ironically, supposed to be attracting, but also repelling, so that they can maintain their honor and the reputation of the sorority, certainly. And so all of this is sort of taking place, but written between the lines, and because no one's coming up and saying this stuff from nationals. They're focused instead on freedom of association at this time. So it's this sort of creating an ideal woman who is going to actually go back and be like that. The ideal is domestic womanhood, and priming them for that through these training, through the interaction, the heterosocial interaction with the fraternity men. I would say that they're not really feminist organizations. I mean, certainly you would say that the women who were the first women on campus were definitely pioneers in higher education. And scandalously wanting to go to colleges where it was all men, not just a women's college. And so there's that, definitely that to be, looked at. But to consider all these women sort of radical feminist women is not really correct for their time, because they wanted to be educated, certainly, but they often were ready to use their education to go back home to raise the next generation of white Protestant children, and be good homemakers, be good members of their community. It's this sort of maternalist ideal. They weren't against women who were career women. They understood that sometimes people needed to make money. They didn't get married. They there were different things happening in different people's lives, and they were supportive of that. But really the ideal was, again, this domestic womanhood. And that's sort of what they're leading all these women toward with this heterosocializing.
Wow. There's a lot of people that are going to be picking up your books, I have to tell you, because this is just fascinating. We could go on for days, but this is so interesting. All right, so now you live in the Portland, Maine area. So I'm wondering, what is the best place for me to go and get a meal in the Portland, Maine area? And full transparency, I do love seafood.
Well, that's great, because Portland, Maine is a great place for seafood, and I love seafood too. And there's so many places to go depending on sort of what you're looking for or the season. But I think one place that I think is really great, it's only a few years old. It's called Scales. It's down like right on the water. Great food, awesome looking bar. So it's right in there. And if you didn't like it, you can go somewhere else because there's a lot of different places right down there. But it's been hopping, I think, since it opened a few years ago.
That sounds great. I'm going to hit up Scales and I will let you know what I think of their food. So that sounds like a great recommendation. All right. So if our listeners have more questions for you, and I'm sure that they do, what is the best place for them to reach you or follow you or to give you feedback about the books? How do you want your fans to communicate with you?
Yeah, I have several different ways. I guess first I should say I've just set up a website, but it's not been fully indexed by Google, I don't think yet, but can be reached at margaretlfreeman.com. So sending more people to it is probably good for its visibility. I'm also on Twitter occasionally. I'm on Instagram. I'm on LinkedIn, Margaret L. Freeman, PhD on Instagram and on LinkedIn. So, definitely any of these places, I'll try to get back to you. I'd love to hear from people. I'd love to learn more about, what I would like to do on my website is sort of, consider some of this history and bring it more in line with what's been going on more recently. Because I think it's important to not just look at current or the past 10 years of what's been going on in Greek life without saying, hey, there's this backstory and this has happened time and time again, maybe we can learn something from that. So I think that hopefully I'll be able to add some writings there to sort of address that and bring the two together. But there's always more to talk about in the history too. So if people are interested in that, I would love to talk to them or hear their stories if they have some of those other hidden stories.
Yeah, I think some other hidden stories are going to be coming out as a result of this interview. There's no question about that. But hey, listen, I appreciate the research. I think it's important. I think we need to understand where we came from in order to figure out what's the best way to move forward from here. So for that, I do think the research is very, very important. So if you want to go and pick up the book is called Women of Discriminating Taste, White Sororities, and the Making of American Ladyhood. Margaret, thank you so much for your time. I truly, truly appreciate it. And I thank you for all the work that you've done here.
Thank you very much, Michael. I really enjoyed the time and having the chance to talk about some of this with you.
That sounds great. Sounds great. And to our listeners, thank you for listening. Please like and share this video with other people that you think are going to be interested in Margaret's book. And we appreciate you being here. We'll see you on another episode of Fraternity Foodie. Bye for now.